Some ASMR, back with another video, and in this video we're going to be learning how periods work. So what is a period? So a period or menstruation is the shedding of the endometrial lining, specifically the decidua functionalis, from the uterus. It is triggered by hormonal withdrawal, primarily involving progesterone and to a lesser extent the estrogen, at the end of a non-conceptive menstrual cycle. The bleeding typically lasts 3 to 7 days and marks day 1 of a new cycle. So what is the physiology behind menstruation or period? We have this thing called the HPO axis regulation. HPO stands for hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, and that is the axis, the hormonal axis that is responsible for controlling the menstrual cycle. So let's explore each component of this axis. First, we have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is responsible for releasing gonadotropin-releasing hormone in a pulsatile manner. The frequency and amplitude of gonadotropin-releasing hormone pulses regulate the luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone secretion. Furthermore, constant gonadotropin-releasing hormone can lead to orderly release of the gonadotropin-releasing hormone in a constant fashion, can lead to the suppression of the release of luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. And this can be a clinical target that involves pharmacologic suppression using a medication called leuprolide. Next component we have is the anterior pituitary gland. In this pituitary gland, we have the production and release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. The follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the follicular growth in the ovaries, and the luteinizing hormone triggers ovulation and maintains the corpus luteum. And then, of course, we have the ovaries. The ovaries are responsible for producing estrogen and progesterone, which modulate the endometrium and provide feedback to the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. And here's a nice figure that shows the feedback loops involved, where we have the negative feedback towards the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland from the secretion of the estrogen and progesterone. But then we can have positive feedback when the estrogen level surpasses the threshold. That can lead to more secretion of your GnRH and then your LH and FSH. Additionally, this hormone called inhibin is known to also inhibit the anterior pituitary gland. Alright, now let's talk about the phases of the menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle typically lasts for about 28 days, but normal range can be anywhere between 21 to 35 days. The first phase is called the ovarian phase. This can be broken down into 3 time periods, the first one being the follicular phase. It can happen anywhere between days. It can last from days 1 to 14, and it can be variable. So the follicular phase begins with the menses, and this is where FSH is released and leads to growth of the dominant follicle. And only one follicle becomes dominant estrogen also induces a proliferative effect on the endometrium. Then, at approximately day 14, ovulation happens. This is where the surge in estrogen takes place, and so the estrogen surpasses the threshold concentration, and positive feedback occurs as a result. This leads to luteinizing hormone surge. The luteinizing hormone surge causes the completion of meiosis I in oocyte, along with follicle rupture. This is basically the physiological significance of ovulation, the rupturing of the follicle, and then afterwards the ovulated oocyte is swept into the fallopian tube. Finally, we have the luteal phase, which takes place from days 15 to 28. This is a post-ovulatory phase where the ruptured follicle becomes the corpus luteum, and then the corpus luteum secretes progesterone and then some estrogen, and then the progesterone stabilizes and secretory transformation of endometrium in order to prepare for the implantation of the mature egg. And so remember that the progesterone will help to stabilize the endometrium and induces secretory transformation to prepare for implantation. However, if there is no fertilization, the corpus luteum will degenerate, there will be hormonal withdrawal, and then eventually menstruation. And then we have the endometrial phases, which takes place in the uterus. This will also be driven by ovarian hormones. So the first phase is called the menstrual phase. It takes place or lasts from days 1 to 5 of the menstrual cycle. In this phase, progesterone and estrogen levels drop. There is also vasoconstriction of the spiral arteries, and then ischemic necrosis of the tissues in the endometrium. This leads to shedding of superficial endometrial layer. And this is where the menstruation takes place and the bleeding that is associated with it. The next phase is called proliferative phase, which takes place from days 6 to 14. This is where estrogen secreted from the granulosa cells begins to promote the regrowth of the endometrial lining. The glands are straight and mitotically active, and the stroma is dense. The estrogen induces progesterone receptor expression within the endometrium. And then finally we have the secretory phase, which takes place from days 15 to 28, where after ovulation, the progesterone from the corpus luteum stops mitosis of the egg, stimulates or just stops mitosis of the endometrial lining cells, and stimulates glandular secretion, which involves glycogen-rich fluids. And then the spiral arteries will begin to elongate. And then if implantation doesn't occur, the corpus luteum will involute, and then the progesterone levels will drop, and then menstruation will take place, which brings us back to the menstrual phase. So what I want you to appreciate about menstruation is the hormonal feedback loops involved. Regarding the hormone estrogen, there's negative feedback at low to moderate levels, but once the threshold is reached and surpassed, then positive feedback occurs. And this is responsible for triggering the luteinizing hormone surge. Progesterone is primarily involved in negative feedback toward the gonadotropin releasing hormone in the hypothalamus, and then the luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone release in the release of follicle-stimulating hormone in the anterior pituitary gland. Regarding the histology of the uterus, during the proliferative phase, the gland morphology tends to be straight and mitotic, and the stromal changes tend to be dense and proliferating, and then the spiral arteries can be seen to be elongating. During the secretory phase, the gland morphology tends to be coiled and secretory. Stromal changes tend to be edematous. And then the arterial changes involve spiral arteries becoming more prominent. And then during the menstrual phase, the gland morphology is more degenerating in nature. The stromal changes are necrotic, and there is vasoconstriction and breakdown. So, some clinical notes to highlight. There's this thing called anovulation, where you have unopposed estrogen secretion, and then there's endometrial hyperplasia, which leads to irregular bleeding. There's also luteal phase defects, where there's inadequate production of progesterone, which leads to infertility. And then primary amenorrhea, where there's a failure of menses by the age 15, or menstruation by the age 15, but the patient also has normal secondary sex characteristics. On the other hand, secondary amenorrhea involves the absence of menses or menstruation of greater than or equal to 3 cycles, or 6 months in someone who has previously menstruated. So, here's a summary table for you to reference to keep track of all the hormones involved in menstruation. For the follicle-stimulating hormone, it is rising during the follicular phase, or follicular stage. There's a slight surge during ovulation, and then low levels during luteal phase. It typically rises during menstruation. For the luteinizing hormone, it is low in concentration levels at the follicular phase, but it surges during ovulation, and then returns to low levels in the luteal phase. And during menstruation, there's low levels of it. On the other hand, estradiol rises in the follicular phase, and it peaks during the ovulation phase, and then returns to moderate levels in the luteal phase, and then returns to low levels during menstruation. And then progesterone continues to be at low levels until the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle is reached, which is then when it gets released significantly, and then it returns back to low levels during menstruation. And the levels can be seen in this diagram, or at least represented. We see that progesterone rise after the luteal phase. On the other hand, we don't see the rise in luteinizing hormone until this ovulation happens. So, that's pretty much it regarding the basic science and physiology behind menstruation or periods. Let me know if you want more videos like this in an ASMR style, and feel free to add other important details and information in the comment section below. I'll see you next time.